like to welcome our live audience here in the beautiful arena here at COSI in downtown Columbus. Also welcome to everybody on the internet. It's good to have you participating today on behalf of the Ohio Soybean Council, the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, and the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. I'd love to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for a conversation. It's going to be an interesting conversation on biotechnology. We're going to be talking sustainability and your food supply. We're going to discuss the impact that GMOs and sustainability have on the environment, health, and your food supply. It was funny, when I was growing up, and I just shared this a moment ago, when I was growing up, my dad would always look at me and say, hey, if you like to eat, you need to learn how to cook. And now I think we've gone beyond that. We're such a food culture now. Not only do we like to cook and try new recipes, but we want to know the source of that food, and we want to know what's involved in that food. So that's going to be the basis of our conversation today. I'm Joel Riley. I do the morning show at 610 WTVN, and if you listen, thank you, and if you don't, keep it to yourself. Today's panel discussion is going to be a part of the U.S. FRA Food Dialogues. The food dialogues have been taking place in several cities around the United States. These panel discussions bring together local leaders, scientists, and educators, the people that you see in front of us, farmers and consumers, and media for in-depth conversations about the food that we all eat. I'd like to invite everyone joining us here at COSI, you folks here in the audience live, and the folks online. If you have a question that you'd like answered from someone on the panel, feel free to submit it, and we'll do our best to get those questions answered over the next 60 minutes. Now, for you folks that are joining us online, you can join the conversation on Twitter. You can follow us at USFRA. You can join us at Ohio Farm Bureau using the pound food D. Make sure you get the extra D on there, capital at the end, hashtag. You can also post your questions on Facebook on the Ohio Soybean Farmers or Ohio Farm Bureau Federation Facebook pages. So we're really reaching out. We're trying to make it easy for you to reach back, and we hope that the conversation, not just among the panelists today, but it's around all of us. Now, for those of you here in the live audience at COSI, you've received an index card when you got here. So what we'd like you to do is, if you have a question that occurs to you, feel free to write it down, and we're going to ask you to pass it to our right, your left, this way, okay? And we have runners working on the end. We're going to submit those cards, and the nice people are going to write the questions, and I'm going to have them here in a handy-dandy little iPad. So it should work out very well. Two separate panels are being held today here in Columbus. This morning, we're going to have our biotechnology, the GMO discussion, and your food panel discussion. This panel is going to include experts who are well-versed on the use of biotechnologies and how it relates to food production and, more specifically, labeling. We're covering the whole range here today, and we appreciate you being here. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to today's participants, and I'm going to start on my left, which would be your right. First is Alan Armstrong. Alan is an Ohio grain farmer. Dr. Andrew Michel, an assistant professor of entomology at The Ohio State University. We can call you a bug guy, right?
Sure, you can.
Very good. Dr. Casey Hoy, Kellogg Endowed Chair in Agricultural Ecosystem Management at The Ohio State University. Jane Boback, local registered dietitian, and she promises to talk probably more than anybody up here.
No.
Okay, I guess we're going to start later on that. Ruth McDonald is here. She's a registered dietitian and professor of food science and human nutrition at Iowa State University, and we had a little conversation. She teaches on entry level and also higher level, so great background there. Doug Billman, who is an Ohio organic dairy and grain farmer, and about 272 acres, right?
Right.
Right on there. And our final panelist is Mike Sopko with the Ohio Restaurant Association, also a board member and restaurateur. Very good. You look like a restaurateur.
Thank you.
Serious and a guy who's not willing to take a chance. I always heard in restaurant business, the best way to take a big pile of money and turn it into a small pile was own a restaurant. Is that true?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay.
And
That's why you see the stress lines.
And I've done that.
You've done that? Okay, good enough. As a reminder, we are going to be taking your questions from both you who are here with us at COSI and from our audience joining us online. So we encourage your participation. We'd love for you to participate in the conversation. And like I said, it's up to me to try to get some of those questions in. Our two panel discussions are going to be broken up by a short lunch. So you on the web, prepare your own. We here, we're going to adjourn to the next room. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll come back with discussion on sustainability and your food. So we've got an hour, so we're going to try to cram in as much as we can. My job is to facilitate So how about we get rolling? And I think probably what we want to start with, and Andy, if we can start with you, just what is GMO?
Well, I think when we discuss GMOs, I think what most people's perceptions of GMOs is the use of transgenics. And so we're talking about crops, and we're specifically talking about inserting a gene from one species into another species. And in the US, mainly that refers to the insertion of either herbicide tolerance or insect resistance into 3 major crops, and that's cotton, corn, and soybean. And so I think that's what most people think about when you hear genetically modified organisms. The public's perception is really focused on just the transgenic aspect. As a scientist, I think, in looking at the genetics, when we think about genetically modified organisms and all of our crops, 10,000 years ago, when domestication and human civilization and the rise of agriculture first started, virtually all crops that we have today, by definition, have been genetically modified. You look at the wild ancestors of corn, teosinte, it's about this big and maybe 3 or 4 kernels. You look at soybean, the wild progenitor of soybean, really low on the ground. Pepper, the wild pepper fruit is about the size of your thumbnail. And through selective traditional breeding, domestication, artificial selection, we've changed the genome architecture of those plants to yield qualities and characteristics that we want for our food and for our crops. So I think GMOs, in my opinion, and scientifically encompasses most of all the crops, but yet I think there is a useful distinction when we talk about transgenics as one form of genetic modification.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people get concerned about it though when it's man putting it in there. Like if I have a pumpkin patch and I take the seeds out of the biggest, most perfect pumpkin, I'm thinking Charlie Brown here, there's something that's different about saving those seeds for next year's crop versus somebody, putting needles and mists into the air and coming into the seeds that way.
It is different, but that process of transgenics is also occurs in nature with viruses, with transposons, not to get technical, but these are pieces of DNA that can jump around the genome, and that's termed horizontal gene flow. So gene flow between species occurs naturally. It's with genetically or with transgenic crops, it's in a lab that we move specifically and precisely the targets that we want, and we know where they're inserted into the genome.
Yeah, and when we talk about organic farming, I know you're listening, and there's some natural nature to that. But how do you respond to that when you hear that that introduction to GMOs?
I understand where he's coming from because I can appreciate genome selection. I have a registered Jersey dairy cow, and they use that in cattle, so you can do your mating to, let's say, get a homogeneously polled animal, which means all of your cows are going to be polled. So if they can identify that in a parentage that I can do by natural selection mating, I'm all for that. And that's kind of where I look at the crops. If you're identifying something that's useful in crop production, whether it's yield or let's say some kind of disease resistance, and you can identify that and breed it by standard plant geneticist breeding, I don't have an issue with it because they can identify it as a seedling or whatever. What I have an issue is whether my biggest concern would be the cross-pollination. Neighbor across the road has a genetically modified corn or soybean crop, and how is it affecting my crops, which I'm feeding to my cows? And is there a question of integrity then of when the person buys my certified organic product of whether there's possible contamination?
Okay, and see, and I think we'll open it up for discussion, but it seems pretty diverse. It's natural selection, and we're making things better. I mean, you have a pepper that's this big, and now we grow them big. But contamination, when we talk about contamination, and I want it to be natural. A lot of times, like an apple tree, there's a lot of natural on there, but there's worms and there's spots, and they're not great looking fruit. So do you think we're too wrapped up in how that stuff presents, or is it that we're concerned that it's not nutritional anymore?
I think what Doug's concern was so if we have transgenic crops grown next to organic or non-GMO crops, there is a risk of that gene that's been inserted into the transgenic crop entering into, say, Doug's farm, and that is a valid concern. And from Doug's perspective, I'm sure he doesn't want that gene in there. And I think we need to do a better job of making sure that doesn't happen. There are monitoring procedures in place to look at that. But I think that's where we need a little bit more research and to make sure that that does not happen and develop strategies to ensure that that risk is as minimal as possibly can be.
Yeah, Alan, I'm curious, as a grain farmer, it seems like GMOs would really amplify your output. Your yields would be great. Is that a concern to you that the quality's not there?
Well, I guess I look at it from the standpoint, when we've been, started hybrid seed corn way back, there's always been that risk of that entering, that cross-pollination. That's not new to GMO. In fact, today we have the strategies, and on our farm, some of our crops are GMO, some of them are not, because that is just one tool. I think the notion that everything is GMO, that's not correct. It's just one of the tools in my toolbox that I use to lower my carbon footprint, if you will, because I'm concerned about the entire environment. I'm very concerned about the integrity of our food supply. And I'm, if people want organic, I think that's wonderful. If people want non-GMO, I want them to make that decision for the right reasons, for the informed decision, if it's, what's right for them, but at the same time, there's no scientific facts that says that what I raise is causing any harm to anyone. And the fact that, it's almost like, potato, yes, by naturally we're taking this one and shaking the pollen over here to get this hybrid or to do this cross. And the fact that it's the method, it's not really the fact we all agree that we've been modifying our food since the beginning of time. It's the method that we're using that's a little different. And that's just new, better science. And I think it's better because we can be very specific as to what trait. When you're just doing it naturally, you may get some unintended consequences. And I mean, any of the guys that do that for a living will tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can zero in and be very precise about what we want to do. And I think that's better.
I think,
Go.
if I could respond
Sure.
to that, I think that is where the concern lies. It's not so much the technology, but how is the technology being used? And by whom and for what sort of intent? Because we do have this precision, or the assumed precision. So there are two concerns with that. One is who's using it and how, and it is in the hands of very large corporations. We have a regulatory system that ensures that that's basically who can really use this technology. You get wrapped up with profit motive and how it's used and why. So it's not really, from my perspective, not really being used very well, given the precision with which we can use it. So far, it's not really being used in an integrated pest management paradigm, which has been kind of the dominant idea in how you go about controlling pests and weeds and the like for quite a long time. It's not really being used to produce good food. And when I say good food, I'm using the W.K. Kellogg Foundation definition of good food, which is healthy, fair, green, and affordable. So it gets about 1 out of those 4 really in the way that it's being used. And I think a lot of the concern then is about, okay, so what is exactly the intent if we have this kind of precision? A, what's the intent in using that precision and what's it really supporting? And B, are we as precise as we really think we are in how the technology is being used? So a lot of the concern that you see out there is, yeah, we have this idea that we can be extremely precise, but do we really know that we're being that precise? I guess from my perspective, again, scientifically and thinking genetically, if we really know the entire genetic correlation matrix for all the organisms we're talking about and the entire gene by environment interaction, then we've got real precision, but we don't know that.
Yeah, I'm curious
But
too.
we're closer than we've ever been.
We are getting
and
closer.
we'll continue to get there. And I think you paint with a very broad brush when you say that agriculture is not using it in an integrated pest management strategy. Our farm is a shining example of that. There's no incentive for me to pay for those extra traits that I don't need. I mean, we all are trying to provide a living for our families. And the notion that I would use something that just because it's there or because it's convenient really just isn't true. I mean, I hear that, and there are, there's bad actors everywhere, but I don't think you can take the broad brush and say that my industry as a whole is doing that, because we're not.
And let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that you're not using integrated pest management, Alan. I'm saying that the way that the technology is being used right now it has to compete with other products, the other alternatives. So it's being used basically as a hammer. So one way of completely controlling particular pests. That's the way BT crops are being used. They're there to kill, or the gene is there to kill every one of those pests in the field. That's not the pest management paradigm. Integrated pest management is a combination of tactics that maintains a population below levels that will do economic harm. This is basically right back around to the standard kind of pesticide control, try to kill every pest in the field approach.
But the reality is, even the best BT doesn't get every one of them.
For some of the events. And that's an issue as well.
So
with
there- and there are
how long is that going to last, and what are we really sustaining here, which to me, a lot of what I see being sustained is product cycles.
And you know, that could be the business model that some of those companies want to use, but the reality is, when you're at the farm gate level, you know, we're all about what is the best for us in the whole big picture. I mean, you know, you hear this a lot, and for me, I do use that as part of my integrated pest management. I just do. I mean, we always have. It's the responsible thing to do. But we're still out there checking that to be sure that that's working. And we're mixing up the events that we use so we don't build up resistance to it. So
Yeah, that sounds like a responsible way to handle. I'm curious, ladies, that from a dietitian perspective, we hear, you know, a good food and what is a good food. And I think most consumers are concerned about nutrition. I mean, you like it to present well, you take home back, you know, I have a protein, I have a green, you get to make the plate look nice. But if you're serving food that's not nutritious, then, I mean, what are you really doing? So when you hear this conversation about the GMOs, are the foods we're eating now, are they nutritious?
Yes, they are.
More nutritious as a result of GMOs?
I believe so.
Okay, tell me
Yes.
why.
Because they have more vitamins and minerals, especially like with Kellogg's. They spray those, don't they? Their cereals with vitamins, I think.
I really don't know.
Yeah, I believe they do.
I was talking about the foundation,
Yeah.
not the company.
Yeah, the foundation.
Two different things.
Yeah. So, and my perspective is that it's affordable and it's convenient and it's nutritious as well. As long as they're eating all their fruits and vegetables, I'm happy.
Okay, I got it. And
But
would
those
you
aren't
agree?
where.
Well, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what GMO is in the supermarket.
Okay.
There almost nothing in the produce aisle is GMO. I mean, basically, the foods that we eat that are GMO are corn and soybean derived. We don't eat cotton, that's the other crop, and then canola comes mostly from Canada, mostly oil. So really, very limited amounts of foods in the food supply are GMO. If you look at where we put corn and soybean, it goes into a variety of foods. We use the cornstarch, the corn oil, we use the soy protein. And so yes, it gets spread through the food supply, but the actual genetic component or the protein that's in the crop is very diluted out when it goes into those products. So there's not really any protein or DNA in cornstarch or corn oil. So when we put that into the food supply, we're not really consuming GMO in the sense that we're eating, you know, the whole plant.
Even when I drink my Pepsi with the
high fructose corn syrup? Very little protein or DNA is going to find its way into the carbohydrate fraction, which is what the corn syrup is going to be.
So what do you think drives the concern about it? I mean, people get so whipped up, like you think back to Jenny McCarthy, and she has a child with autism, and it's the
Right.
shots, can't do that. And
Right.
for some reason, people listen to Jenny McCarthy. I'm not really sure if she's a great medical person to be taking your advice from, but it starts somewhere. And so
Oh,
what is it
yeah.
about GMOs that make people,
It's a scary word. We're talking about manipulating DNA, and people don't quite understand what, you know, they don't know necessarily that food has DNA in it. It sounds like it's unique to the kinds of plants that they're doing this technology to, but strawberries, carrots, apples have DNA. We eat it all the time. We don't incorporate that DNA into our body, and people don't get that. They don't understand necessarily what happens to food when we eat it, and so they're concerned that something bad will happen if I eat a genetically modified plant, because that DNA will get into me. It's sort of, you know, akin to irradiating food. Irradiation is a great way to kill certain things, certain pests, and knock down enzymes that, you know, change the ripening, but people think it becomes radioactive. It doesn't. It's the same thing with GMO. It's a technology that people don't get and they're fearful of.
Mike, I'm curious, in the restaurant business, do you have patrons that come to restaurants with any regularity and ask, am I eating GMO foods? Is this a concern to your clientele?
No,
Not at all.
no. I mean, we have a lot of questions about allergens,
Okay.
you know, peanut allergens, soy, et cetera, but I've yet to have somebody ask me if we're serving GMO foods in the restaurants.
Do you get from restaurateurs like yourself, is there a concern among you as a group of people serving foods? Do you see people looking more at that as a concern?
I think people want to know the caloric content. They want to know what's in their food from a standpoint of what the products are. What they really want is they want their food to be safe. You know, we want to provide a safe product to our consumers. But when it comes down to GMO or GMO labeling from the National Restaurant Association, I mean, we oppose that. Menus are cluttered enough, and it would only clutter them that much more. And what people sometimes fail to realize is that all of that labeling and every regulation that comes across that we have to comply with, ultimately the consumer is going to pay for that. I think there's enough choices out there today that if you want organic food, it's available to you, and it's available through restaurants also.
Very good. I got a question here. Tracy from Ohio says, and I'll refer back to our entomologist, is there any scientific proof that GMO crops are hurting bee populations?
No, as far as I know. I think there is a large concern about honeybee populations and colony collapse disorder, but I think from all the testing, the suggestions is that it's not from the BT, and that it might be some other chemicals that could be possibly used in the environment. But BT itself, as far as I know, there have been no studies, or virtually no studies, that show that there's any toxicity to bees.
Yeah, and
that
bees
issue.
are such a key part of what you all do for a living. I mean, getting food to the plate. Has there been further investigation on that?
Well, the other thing too, especially with honeybees, is that and I'm not a honeybee specialist, but I think we can find honeybees in cornfields. But for the honeybee to be exposed to the BT that's in the corn plant, that honeybee has to go to the corn, has to pick up that pollen and take it back to its hive. When we think of honeybees, very rarely, I think, do we think of them pollinating corn. Corn is a self-wind pollinated plant, and it doesn't necessarily rely on honeybees. Now, that's not to say that honeybees are not flying into the corn and doing pollination, but it's very, very rare. Honeybees rely on a lot of fruits and vegetables to get a lot of their pollen from. And right now, at least in the US, and I think most of the world, those plants right now are not transgenically modified with BT. So not only does the toxicity of BT to honeybees is relatively low, the natural exposure to honeybees to BT is also very, very, very low.
It's interesting.
Could I add something
Yeah,
to that?
sure.
I actually am another bug guy, so Andy and I are in
Yeah, same
the same department. And Andy's absolutely right about the direct effects, and we haven't seen that indirectly. What BT crops are supporting is a very large-scale approach, which results in a simplified landscape with fewer resources for honeybees in it. And that is of concern to honeybee populations. Where are they finding flowers? If you now have the technology to come up with, an astounding level of productivity, but essentially fence row to fence row of single crops, and just a few of them, now you've resulted in a landscape that honeybees really can't survive in very well. And that is a problem for honeybees.
Yeah,
But really, that doesn't matter if it's a GMO crop or a non-GMO crop. That's just a mono.
That is the system that
would-
it's part of.
So really, the GMO issue got nothing to do with it. In fact, anecdotally, we have learned that, and sometimes there has been the effect of, and we've all heard about, these honeybees that, died next to a cornfield. We've related it back to, we use a product called talc, which is like baby powder, and that's what we use in our seed delivery system. I mean, it's just as simple as what we put on all of our children. But when we would fill our planter, there's always a little cloud of that. The cloud of that would get on the plants, that would taint the pollen, and that's what caused it. So it was nothing to do with the corn and everything to do with the talc. So what have we done? We have different procedures that we follow, so we don't do that. We don't do that up next to a fence row. We don't do that close to, a crop that will host honeybees.
And one more thing too, I think, from my perspective, when we talk about BT, especially when we're looking about late season, when corn is pollinating, when honeybees might be in that field grabbing some corn pollen, 10, 20 years ago, I think before the reliance or before the use of BT, a lot of maybe general broad spectrum pesticides were being applied at that stage, which those could have been harmful for honeybees. Nowadays, there has been a decreased amount of insecticide use in the late season corn stage for corn, which has provided a more of a safer avenue for honeybees. So it might even be quite the opposite, that BT is actually, or in the production of BT, from an exposure to insecticides has helped honeybee populations.
I want to add a couple comments here. First thing, I've been both sides of the fence. I was conventional before I was organic. And when I was younger, one of the things you saw driving down the highways in Ohio was volunteer corn and soybeans before GMO was around. Now that I've been organic, I've never used a GMO crop. But now as I'm organic and I drive around Ohio, I see soybeans now that have volunteer corn in them. I see a lot of soybean fields that have been herbicide twice now, initially when they're planted and then a second time to get rid of the volunteer corn that's growing out there. So that's my concern, is the extra use of insecticide. And other than some yield stuff, especially to Alan, who's growing non-GMO and GMO crops, there's times sitting back as an organic producer and been on both sides of the fence where I've done no-till before I was organic and all this stuff. I don't know sometimes what you've gained. And then as far as the honeybee situation, come to my dairy farm where I'm moving pasture and clover, and you can hear the bees buzzing out there. I mean, I actually had one of my workers get a bee in her boot one day when she was moving the fence. Luckily, she didn't have an allergic reaction to it. And then one more thing, being on a dairy side of it, is dairy products are very scrutinized. They're very labeled. They're very, any kind of bacteria, issues that happen, contamination things. We're very monitored for that. Dairy products as a whole are policed like you wouldn't believe. Inspector comes to the farm every 6 months and makes sure your equipment's clean. And so we go through all this regularizations to do that, and then to take one more step, and this is how I look at GMO crops, is there was a product on the market that's probably still available, but very few dairy farmers use it, called RBST, or bovine stromatotrophin. Pretty much consumers don't want that anymore. So before we were organic, we got a little zip tie put on our tank saying we weren't going to use BST anymore. And so that was your affidavit saying you weren't going to use it. That's why organics is important to the consumer, because they know to our best integrity by being certified that they're not getting that in their milk. So my controversial statement, as I'm going to add, is if GMOs are an issue, then why are you afraid to say this product may contain GMO crop?
Yeah, that's one of the concerns. In fact, a question from the audience says poll of consumers shows about 80 to 90% of people would like to see GMO labeling on there. But if we're not metabolizing it and it's only in cotton, corn, and beans, why do you think people want to see that?
I think that again, this idea of people want to know what's in their food, they want to know where it comes from, and I'm all for that. I think that we want people to know more about their food. The trouble comes in, as Mike was saying, with the rules and the regulations. It's not going to come cheap to do this, and as I mentioned, it's traceability and detecting the GMO and being able to say that this is or this isn't coming from a GMO source, and that, I think, is my opposition to the labeling is the cost that it will take to do the regulating of it. We have lots of other bigger issues relative to food safety in our world, that to take our finite resources for safety in food and put it into GMO, I think would be not the best use of the funding that we have. So I think labeling, it's going to, probably most people would look at it, say, that's fine, I'm okay with that. Or they look at the price and they decide whether they're going to buy this organic or that, that might not be labeled that way. And it would probably, moderate the market over time, and it would not be a big issue. wonder about how much cost it would have to get that started.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Mike, I mean, Doug, you seem to allege almost that the GMO people are hiding. Like, we don't want people to know.
Well,
this is
it
what
comes
we're doing.
across to me, being an organic producer
Yeah.
and being a dairy producer where the dairy industry was scrutinized for BST, which occurs naturally in the milk anyways. Because I can tell you the best milking cow on my herd has more naturally occurring BST in her milk than the lower producing. That's what makes her milk more.
And that's the other issue with
And,
labeling is that
but do you follow where I'm coming from, though, is that the dairy industry got put under the microscope for this. The dairy industry got shot for putting the same hormone in cows that it's already there naturally, that you can take this milk and this milk from a BST cow and from a non-BST cow, and you're going to find BST, and you can't tell which one's which. But yet, the GMO sector, or I'm going to put corporate America, not the Allens of the world, the corporate America doesn't want the consumer to know that that's possibly in their food. And when we're one of the 3 countries in the world that are primary growers, which is the United States and Brazil, and oh, by the way, most of the big crop farmers in Brazil are Americans who went to Brazil during the winter to start growing crops down there because they wanted something else to do. Okay?
Because farmers aren't busy enough, right?
But do you follow where I'm coming from? Why does the rest of the world put this big flag up? Why does the rest of the world, 55 countries in the rest of the world, label the stuff? Why is the United States saying, we don't want any part of that? To me, it's not Allen. It's not anybody on this panel. It's corporate America saying, we don't want the consumer scared because it's all about our stockholders and our return to our stockholders.
I was just going to suggest that I mean, I agree with Ruth, I'm for transparency and that's fine, but why do we need to single out GMOs? Why is it that if it's a GMO, it has to be labeled? Why don't, for conventional, why do we consider, well, I'd like to know if it's for full transparency, if it's a conventional apple, I'd like to know how many times that may have been sprayed with an insecticide. You know, if it's an organic product, if I'm buying an organic bag of lettuce, I want to know, well, how many times was manure applied to that? How many times was that product washed to remove the E. coli on that? So if we're all for a full transparency, I think we should have that, and maybe we should consider relabeling some of the organic produce to make sure that that's safe as well. Because, you know, I think when we look at all food, whether it's GMO, non-GMO, conventional, organic, all food I think has risks. But for singling out a technology like GMO that has, you know, through hundreds and hundreds of studies proven to be safe to consume, I think is a little almost misleading to the public, especially when we have misinformation that is already out there.
I mean, I think the reality is GMO has been the most tested food, or most tested crops ever. And the fact that here in the United States, we trust science-based decisions, and we have resources to do that testing that the rest of the world don't. And so we have the scientific facts behind us to say, this is safe, it's good, it's safe, there's not a problem. And I think that's a great thing in this country because we have that ability to have those resources to be able to say that. So I think that's why we don't need a label. And I think it's the fear of the unknown because in the other countries where they're required. I mean, you know, I feed my family out the same food supply as everybody. I'm a consumer too. I'm a farmer, but I'm also a consumer. And, you know, there are lots of questions I have about my food and, you know, based on good science, it's just you know, I just don't see the need to label it as that because that's not that much different.
Yeah.
Well, and one point where I would agree with Mike is that really consumers, I mean, there are 2 ways that you can go about it. You can go out and really push the political process for labeling, or as a consumer, you can exercise your vote every time you buy. So there are ways to, I mean, the standard advice I give to anybody who's concerned about the food they're eating is buy it from somebody you know. Talk to them. And we can do that in Ohio. We have a state where even our dense urban areas are still ringed with farmland. That's actually pretty rare. So this is a place where you can do that. You can buy your food from people you know and talk to them about how it's being produced.
That's fascinating too because we've seen such an explosion of farm markets. And I don't know how regulated farm markets are, but you know, there's some people that would race to those thinking, well, that's got to be better than what I buy at Walmart because that guy grew it and he's just got dirt. But you don't know. You don't know unless you know him, unless he's your neighbor right across the fence. You don't know what he did, how
I
he
think
did it.
that's a great point, and I think that there's a real movement of people to try to know their farmer and try to be closer to the farm. And I think that there's a unfortunate caveat of that says that, well, then everything in the grocery store has to be bad. And that's not true. The same farmers that are at the farmers market are selling their grocery to the grocery stores. And actually there's some reason to think that there's more controls at the grocery store than at the farmers market. I think that there's a unfortunate kind of fear that we're generating in our food supply today that we must be worried about everything, antibiotics, and we must be worried about whether or not there's pesticides. And the assumption is that it's got to be, if it's grown conventionally, it must have all those bad things in it. And the organic is perfectly safe. And I don't think that that's true. I mean, I think that there's not really fear of the conventionally grown food, that there's something bad in it. And that's what labeling would add to, this idea that if it doesn't have that, it must have something bad in it. And that's never been shown.
I think that's, Mike, again, from the restaurant perspective, we talk about, the consumer, I'm buying food, I'm taking it home. But it's fascinating to me because you said earlier, it's almost like it doesn't translate to the restaurant. It's almost people have different concerns about what they consume or buy for their home, but maybe not as much on your level.
Well, I think a lot of consumers, when they go out to dinner, are going out for an experience. It's not just to eat. They may eat extremely healthy at home. They might buy only organic food, but my experience in the business is some of the biggest selling items we have on some of the menus in restaurants I used to own were fried foods, which traditionally aren't very good for you, but yet those are the ones that sell. I think that if the consumer tells us that they're not going to eat in our restaurants as a whole because they believe there's GMOs in there, we're going to have to change our business then. I'm questioning where we'll get our supply from, but we'll have to change our business. I think people that want to sell organic products should be able to, and I know people that do. There's a lot of restaurants that source food locally now from local, and I think that's wonderful. And if that supports those places, that increases our business also. So.
And I want to add to what he's just saying because my experience has been local wins first every time. Doesn't matter how the crop's grown, how the milk's produced. If they know it's local, for most consumers that I've talked to, that wins first. Then possibly the organic, and then the next step down the line, especially when you're looking at farmers markets or supply chain, And I'll gladly tell anybody in the Ohio dairy producers, people here, if you want to know where your milk comes from, folks, is where'smymilkcomefrom.com. And you put the code in there and it'll tell you where that milk was processed and it gives you somewhat ideal of where the milk came from. But milk's transportable. It gets shipped all over. It gets put in tankers and goes from this plant to this plant, gets shipped back. So it's just one of those tools that the consumer, if they want to educate themselves, can know, okay? Like I said earlier, my concern as an organic producer is that I'm trying to create an integrity in a product that the consumer is wanting to buy, and by making sure that my crops aren't contaminated, whether it's alfalfa, corn, soybeans, that the feed supply that I'm putting in my cows is not contaminated with that, because I know that the structures of the GMO per se aren't necessarily being utilized by my cow, but there's a whole ecosystem within a cow's gut called a rumen that breaks down all that stuff. And so I don't understand what goes on in there, because I'm not a microbiologist, okay, I'm a dairy farmer. But I also know if I let my cows get into onions, their milk tastes like onions and smells like onions.
And
Same
there's
thing
chocolate
with us,
milk
right?
and strawberry milk, but I don't see a big market for onion milk. No.
And I've never fed my cows strawberries, so maybe that's what I should do, right there.
And see, that leads me to another thought, and Jane, I want to lean on you a little bit for this. We've gotten to a world where we want what we want, and we want it now. It used to be you ate what was in season. It used to be hey, when it was strawberry time, you ate a lot of strawberries.
Yes.
And at the end of that month, maybe you didn't care if you never saw another strawberry, but by next year, you're ready to eat strawberries again.
Yeah.
How much of this is driven by just consumers going, I don't care if my blueberries come from Venezuela, I want blueberries and I want them now, even though they're not in season.
Yeah, and the same thing with asparagus. Like I see asparagus on the shelves today. So, and it's not in season.
Yeah.
It's the spring season that they're.
So when you look at that,
Yeah, can you hear me?
yeah,
Okay.
the things that,
Sorry.
that's okay, but the things,
Okay.
you know, that we ship in from so far away, how much of that, in your opinion, is still as nutritious as it might be? And should we maybe reconsider not only how we eat, but what we eat and have it represent where we are in the calendar?
I think I would still buy those blueberries.
Yeah?
Yes,
Okay,
I think I would. So.
okay. I guess I'm glad I got
Either-
blueberries in the fridge at home.
Yeah, that's right. I only buy organic blueberries, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay. Freezing them's good.
freezing them's good.
That's
yes,
that's a plus. But I
yes.
mean, you know, we get to this time of year in Ohio, you go about every click and there's sweet corn. So you know, people really load up on sweet corn, and when it's the timing of it, from a nutrition perspective, from a dietetics perspective, am I better to eat what's in season? Is that always the best plan?
It is, yes. It's always the best plan. And you know, it's whatever you want. So it's whatever's in season, it's whatever you want. So it's your choice.
Yeah.
I think you're pointing out a really important part of our food supply, and that is that we have abundant variety in the food supply today. And so we can get fruits and vegetables of all kinds all year round, which is unique and actually adds to the health benefits of our food supply. I think that there's a lot of confusion in consumers' minds about transportation costs, and if I have to buy my fruits and vegetables from a local source, and that changes the environmental impact, and those are real questions. But there's also some misinformation about the costs and the health benefits. So we have some food technology approaches to make sure that we do keep the nutrients in the food as close as it is to when we pick it. And those are advances. You can buy salad in a bag now that has, retains its freshness because of food technology. And so we have these advances, and the science of food has given us those advantages. And I feel like a lot of the negativism around GMO is anti-science in food. We push STEM education. We want our children to go into science, but yet there's this disconnect when we're talking about science and food. We don't want the science in our food. And I think that that's unfortunate, because there's some great benefits that technology has given us to improve our food supply.
Got a question from the audience here. It says, and I'll just throw this out, whoever wants to jump on. A well-regarded physician believes that bioengineered wheat is causing the rising occurrence of gluten intolerance and celiac disease. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, we don't grow GMO wheat in the U.S.
I didn't know there was
So there
such
isn't
a-
any GMO wheat.
There's no such
And
thing.
then
There's no
the
such thing.
gluten,
Except for one field in Oregon.
But it might be true, and this brings up the point of conventional breeding, where when we have conventional breeding, because we're breeding for something, we might bring along another traits with it, and it might be something where we can introduce more gluten or maybe more allergens, and the other thing with conventional breeding is that is, I think, less regulated than transgenics. So like I said before, every type of breeding, every type of genetic modification has its own risk associated with it.
the gluten story is very complicated. I think that there's a lot of faddism around gluten right now, and there's a lot of people who think that they are gluten insensitive, and they're not really gluten insensitive. There certainly are people who are sensitive to gluten, and that's a real medical condition. But until you've been tested, and there are very definitive tests that you can take, a doctor can give you to tell that you are or you aren't. So I think it's not necessarily a real phenomenon that we're seeing more gluten insensitivity. It may be being diagnosed more commonly, though.
Okay.
But I think it has nothing to do with GMOs.
It has nothing
No,
to do with
absolutely
GMO.
not.
Absolutely.
How about this? Another question from our audience. Are you aware that the American Medical Association has looked at GMO labeling and has spoken against mandatory labeling? That's the AMA. I mean, that's
Right.
pretty well respected.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of medical associations have found no problem with eating GMO.
And it's not only it's the American Academy of Sciences, it's the Royal Society. I mean, virtually every reputable scientific organization has
Even
found
the
no
Center
difference.
for Science and the Public Interest has
the
said
World
that
Health
there's no
Organization.
reason to fear GMO.
Yeah, and they harsh popcorn at the movies. I mean, come on, they harsh.
Exactly.
Good stuff. Okay, and I think maybe we touched on this, but we'll get a little bit more. Another one from the audience. The big use of corn is for livestock agriculture, dairy, pork, eggs, chickens, beef. What long-term studies are being done to evaluate the health of these animals or the people who eat them?
There's no evidence that animals that have been fed GMO grain have any health consequences.
Okay, and are those studies ongoing?
They've been reproductive studies. They've looked at comparing, animal growth in a variety of ways, and there's never been any evidence that there's any.
And this is an important point too, because I think there's hundreds and hundreds of studies that show that there's no difference between animals fed GMO and non-GMO, and yet there's maybe a handful that show the difference. But yet, what the media picks up on is those studies, which are just a handful. I can probably count them on one hand, and they're published in the science we would say maybe not the best scientific journals. The media sometimes forgets that not all scientific papers are published equally, right? There are some tiers that we use, and a lot of these papers that suggest that there's health impacts are published in these lower tier journals that might have interesting conflict of interest. In fact, there was one that was published this past summer, and I think the headline was, scientists say new study shows pig health hurt by GMO feed. So what they did, they had two sets of pigs, one feed GMO feed, one fed non-GMO feed, and they looked at various health abnormalities or lack thereof in these pigs. And what the authors of the study focused on was that when they looked at stomach information, there was 23 GMO pigs that had severe stomach inflammation versus 9 GMO pigs that had not. So there's a difference there. But when you break down the data, and Alan brought this up too, we're a science society, which is great because with science, we look at data. And data, I think, is impervious to any sort of objectivity, any sort of funding obligations as well. As scientists, when we write a paper, we publish the data, and then in the paper, we provide our interpretation of that data. So when you look at the overall data in that paper, there's some inconsistencies with that result. For example, twice as many non-GMO pigs had liver problems than those fed GMO corn. Twice as many pigs fed non-GMO corn had heart problems than GMO corn. When you looked at the stomach inflammation, these authors broke it down in these 4 categories: mild, moderate, and severe. 31 non-GMO pigs had mild inflammation versus 23, so virtually no difference. If anything, the non-GMO had more. 23 non-GMO compared to 18 for moderate stomach inflammation. And so the authors cherry-picked this data saying that pigs fed GMO feed had more severe stomach inflammation, and the headlines grabbed it. I mean, Joel, you're in the media. What's going to sell more papers? This new study shows pig health hurt by GMO feed, or the fact that GMO feed leads to less liver problems?
What I know about newspaper right now is that not much is selling them.
Is that why you're in radio?
Sorry, my friends at the Dispatch, I apologize.
Well, the other side of it is, with this same argument, is I unfortunately have a gene base that's subject to hypertension. Bottom line. Do I look like somebody would have hypertension? I don't salt, I don't not overweight, but I have an issue. So are these pigs that are having these different levels are genetically predisposed to having more heart, or do you follow me? The pigs in the study, what's the gene pool of the pigs in the study, and what genetic traits do they have for abnormalities physically,
Yeah, and I
as
think
opposed to what they're actually fed? Because I have cows dairy cows get what they call displaced abomasums, where the stomach actually twists around to one side and twists the gut off and blocks it off. Well, I can tell you, they used to say it's really linked to how you feed your cows, but I can tell you from being around dairy cows for 30 plus years, there's a genetic thing. If you have a mom that had a twisted gut, the daughter's liable to have a twisted gut. That cow genetically is more disposed to get that. I've seen that in my cows. And so if you're taking a group of pigs, you don't know what you're getting there. They may be controlled or not controlled, but they have physiological differences that may show different things when you're measuring for that kind of stuff.
Right, and I think the question was about long-term studies. I'm not sure exactly what long-term means for a food animal because they don't tend to last all that long in the first place. But I would agree entirely. We haven't seen acute effects. So you feed pigs GMO, they keel over and die immediately. We're not seeing that. A point that has been raised in previous dialogues, I think this is the point to make it here, is because we have shown no effect, no acute effect, does not mean you will not ever see an effect. That would be proving the null hypothesis. You're not doing that. What you're doing is showing no effect. The long-term chronic exposure in people, in animals, what does that do? I don't think we have long-term enough studies at this point to show that. I would agree that the hypotheses behind that, they're less easy to pose than the ones about acute effects, and those have been rejected in the study so far. But that does not prove that there will never be seen effects.
But we have had GMO corn in the United States since around the 70s. So that's a long time. And if there were anything that was going to come out, farm animals are probably the most watched of any kind of animal, maybe more so than pets, as far as their health. And if there were trends that there was something happening because of what we're feeding them, it would be known. And so that hasn't ever been shown.
So which study, or what's the longest term study that you're aware of then?
Well, I'm just saying it's a natural study because we've been feeding animals grain that's been GMO for, 20, 30 years. And if there had been some weird genetic mutation that arose from that, it would be obvious and we would know it because we do track animal health very carefully, farm animal health.
If you know what you're looking for and how it traces back exactly to
Well,
the diet. And
yeah,
if there are,
Well,
again,
zillion things you could be
effects
looking
that
As
you're
an
not
animal
aware of.
livestock producer, I can tell you there's a natural selection process that occurs on my cows. And so if that cow's affected, let's say, by GMO corn, and this is hypothetical, she may have naturally selected herself out of the herd where everybody else kept going. Now, I'm not saying the GMO caused it, but she might have left the herd because of the GMO corn.
Well, you can say that about anything.
Yeah, it could have been
100 other
anything.
factors. I mean,
Right, you don't know.
You don't know. I mean, the studies go on every day, boots on the ground. I used to be a livestock farmer too, and trust me, if I think there's any inkling that I'm starting to have a problem, I'm starting looking for that solution. Because two reasons. I want my animals to be happy. I want them to be healthy because that is the name of the game in the livestock business. And so, and no offense to our scientist buddies here because I rely heavily on that, but sometimes the absolute best evidence is right out there in my field, in my feedlot, on my farm, talking to other farmers. Are you seeing this? Are you seeing that? How do we take what's similar, what's different, what do we put in and out of that equation? Sometimes the science of removal is just as successful at determining a problem as it is of adding. And there's just not one time where you get a group of livestock producers together that say, man, this stuff just isn't growing as good as it did 10 years ago. That's nothing in life is 100% or absolute. I mean, we have to continue to evolve because we don't know what the next thing is that's coming. And I just don't see any evidence to support anything other than it's safe, reliable, and we should proceed.
It's certainly been more efficient. I mean, you look at this summer in Ohio where normally we're baking 90 degrees and 2 days at football camps, the guys are screaming for pain and the corn's growing a foot a day. And this year we're 70s in the day and 50s at night and stuff keeps coming along. We got a few more minutes and I appreciate all the questions. I'm getting to as many as I can. I do have one, and now I might lean on you for this one. It just says, Colleen from the audience, thanks Colleen. Could you discuss the difference between a hybrid and GMO and use corn as an example?
Well, hybrid seed corn, I proudly in my office have the receipt from when my great-grandfather bought his first bag of hybrid seed corn. And they gave $2.85, I think is what it was. Okay, hybrid seed corn's been around for a long time. That's where you take, the characteristics of this plant, that plant, let's mix the pollen up, then we get this hybrid corn, and we did it for its better traits. You know, the GMO, so hybrids have been around for hundreds of years actually. And you know, there's never been any ill effect to anybody who's ate anything that was produced from a hybrid. You know, the GMO, now we're just zeroing in on one or two specific things that we're introducing into that. So they're very different processes, but they're both trying to have the same objective, and that's to be a safer, healthier, more abundant food.
Good stuff. And you know, and as I listen, there's two things that occur to me, and you know, with the restaurants and organics and that, it seems almost like it's more of a marketing thing. Like, you know, I do organic, and there are people that absolutely want that, and whether it, you know, it really strikes them that this is better for my family, or I can buy it at Walmart or wherever, it's good. And then just like, I'd love everybody up here to recommend what is the place that you go for the best information on my food, if it's healthy, it's nutritious, and all that stuff. Because I mean, that's the question. I mean, there's moms in the audience, there's dads in the audience, we all have kids, we all have people that we feed, and you want your food to be nutritious and safe. So let's start with just the marketing aspect of it. Do you feel like a lot of this conversation is because of hype and marketing, or do you think there really is differences that people need to be aware of?
I guess where I'll come from with the organic sector, and I'm going to approach this from the fact I came from both sides, okay? Originally, I got into organics, and I'm not going to lie to anybody, it was because of an economic thing. You have to graze cows. We've already been grazing cows since '93, so it just kind of fit our model to become organic. But the more I've been organic, the less I see that I have to do things, quote unquote, conventionally. I don't see where I have to do herbicides. I don't see where I have to do insecticides. I found out I can have healthy cows without antibiotics and all that stuff. And yes, it's a consumer choice, but I'm willing to do all the paperwork, all the regulations that has a person come to my farm annually and see that I'm keeping that product, integrity of that, and certified organic's one of the only things that does that, to guarantee that the consumer is getting a viable product. So that's the integrity of the organic sector. Now, whether it's locally grown, all natural, conventional, you know, those are all terms that are just terms, there's no one regulating. So it depends on what that consumer wants. It depends on what that consumer is looking for, what they feel comfortable with. And to be honest with you, I don't know where you really go to any one source to look at that. But the bottom line is, as an organic producer, USDA, National Organic Practices, says what everybody has to do to be organic. And everybody across the country has to follow that. So as a consumer, based on what I produce, I'm saying look at that. It tells what the regs are for every type of vegetable, fruit, animal product. It's all there spelled out by the USDA. Now, whether you want to trust the USDA or not, that's a personal opinion, you know. But at least it's regulated.
But you're making the assumption that conventional is not regulated, and that's not the case.
Well, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying...
Antibiotics, there's rules about when you treat an animal with antibiotics.
Right, and how many days withhold and all that. But I'm just saying that conventional dairy farmer, the conventional grain farmer, does not have an individual on his farm annually. He does not have to turn in all his purchase receipts for fertilizer, insecticides, to somebody to come out and inspect. I have to keep every feed receipt from every pound of feed that I buy for my cows. I have to report every input that I put on my crops. I have to prove that I bought organic source seed.
But I think that the average consumer doesn't understand that conventional farming is regulated, and there are rules and there's tracking. The FDA publishes every year a document that shows where pesticide residues are in the food supply, and it's very minimal. It's always below the standards. So I think that there's this, if you want to buy organic, you can do that, and the consumer has the right to do that, and I think it's great. I just don't want consumers to think that conventional agriculture is somehow bad.
Yeah, I mean, the organic is a choice.
Right.
It's not, in my mind, it's not better, it's not worse. But, my buddies that are conventional dairy farmers, I mean, they have the same restrictions from the antibiotic. I mean, no milk in the state of Ohio or anywhere has got antibiotics in it.
Right,
And I'm not saying it doesn't. Yours or the conventional source. It's not there. So the fear over I'm buying organic because I don't want antibiotics in my milk, that's not the right reason. Now, I want consumers, I guess my parallel is when myself or a family member is ill, or seriously ill, I want to go to the latest science and technology, to the doctors, the hospitals, whoever, that can deliver me the most up-to-date, best scenario to take care of me or my loved one. Why shouldn't I want my food to be produced the same way? Why shouldn't I want the best science? And we all know medicine's not perfect, and agriculture's not perfect. But at the end of the day, I want the safest, most wholesome food supply I can get. And why not use good science for that, just as I do when I'm taking care of my kids?
Okay, and just as a wrap up, I'd like to just go right around the horn as far as food safety, food nutrition. What is good about food? Who do you trust? What organization do you look to say, these people know what they're doing, and so when they say it, it's good?
Well, you're going to start with me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I don't
We'll go alphabetically. Alan, it's you.
I don't think there's one single source you can go to.
Okay.
I mean, I think an educated consumer is the best thing that we can ask for.
Okay.
And I want consumers to go to multiple sources for their information. Mm-hmm. And if they see trends developing together, and talk to a farmer. We're all, you ask 10 farmers the same question, you're going to get 10 different answers. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. Sorry. But over time, I think the answers become clear. But, I don't, decisions on our farm, I don't just trust one. I go to multiple sources, and your food should be the same one.
Very good.
It's the same thing with me, especially science. Science, we use multiple sources, multiple repeatable experiments, and to me, when I make my food choices for me and my family, I rely heavily on USDA, FDA guidelines, which are all backed by science, and I rely on my medical doctor. I don't rely on somebody who's doing, who might be funded by organic research. The medical doctors are going to know what's the best to put in my body, and that's what I rely on.
Healthy, fair, green, and affordable. That's the definition of good food. Healthy is fresh, unprocessed in general, and fair would be no one is being taken advantage of in production of the food. Green is produced in a way that sustains the land and the people on it. And affordable, we know what that means. You can actually access it. When I think of affordable also, I think about not just the food itself, but what's behind it and what am I supporting behind it. And there are farms behind it. So I'll go back to my favorite source. I agree entirely with Alan. It's the farmers that produce it, and we have a place where you can get to know those folks. I think that's the best education, is for people to be in touch with farms and with their food and where it comes from, maybe even get involved with producing some of it themselves.
Yes. And there's all this information on the internet where you can just look up, and I also agree that you have to find your reliable sources. And usually I go to CSPI.
Okay, and that is?
It's, what is it?
Center for Science
Center
and
for
Public
Science
Interest.
and Public Interest.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody jot that down.
Yeah.
CSP. Good stuff.
Well, as an educator and someone who is working with the next generation of food technologists, I think that the food industry gets a bad rap in a lot of this. I think that the food industry and the big food companies are making great attempts at improving our food supply, making it safer, making it more abundant, making it less wasteful. And so, they're not out to poison people. And there's a misconception that anything that's processed has got to be evil and bad. And that's not the case. I mean, you have more variety now. You can have food with fiber. You can have food with high quality nutrients. And there's really nothing unsafe about the food supply that we have today. It's actually safer than ever before, and we are very blessed to have the kind of variety and safety that we have in our food supply.
Very good.
I have to kind of agree with Casey. And even Alan mentioned, get to know your farmer. Get to know the people in your neighborhood, because that's really what your next topic is going to be about. Sustainability is that farmer doing something that's environmentally conscious for the ground, and by getting to know the farmer, you're aware of what his nutrient management is. You're aware of how he's handling his waste, how he's growing his crops, how he's growing vegetables, whatever. Is he's supported by the community? Is the community like the fact that Alan's their next door neighbor, or I'm their next door neighbor? Are they happy about that? And is it profitable for the farm? I mean, that's really what sustainability of agriculture is. So hopefully that's a good segue into the other thing, but the consumer has to get to know where their food's coming from and be happy with where their food's coming from, whether it's the Walmarts of the world or the Whole Foods of the world or the local market.
Good stuff.
There's multiple sources out there that people can go on to find out about their food, but the restaurant industry as a whole has a moral responsibility to serve safe food. And responsible businessmen want their customer base around. So they want the best providers, and they want the best food that they can put on a plate.
Yeah.
So.
Good stuff. Well, I thank everybody's participation. I will say I just saw this in doing research this morning. I don't know if you can see it where you are. It says Chipotle's genetically modified burritos. In the first line, Chipotle becomes one of the first restaurant chains to admit they have genetically modified organisms in half of their dishes. So I don't think the conversation is over, but certainly we have had an excellent panel and we have some great information. So take it, use it, eat, and be healthy. I'd like to thank you all for joining in today's biotechnology conversation. A special thanks to our panelists, Alan Armstrong, Andy Michel, Casey Hoy, Jane Boback, Ruth McDonald, Doug Billman, and Mike Sopko. And thank you to the Ohio Soybean Council, the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, and U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance for hosting today's Food Dialogues event. If you'd like more information to continue today's discussion about science, technology, and food, please make sure you visit fooddialogues.com. I'm Joel Riley. Thanks very much. Drive safe and eat healthy.